Hi, my name is Nikita Urban, and I will be doing a presentation on how African Americans were impacted by the Great Depression. The Great Depression was the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world, lasting from 1929 to 1939. In August of 1929, consumer buying started slowing down due to layoffs. In October 1929, consumer spending comes to a complete halt. On Black Thursday, or October 24th, 1929, 12.9 million overpriced shares were sold. That following Tuesday, Black Tuesday, or October 29th, 1929, 16 million overpriced shares were sold. These shares were sold and bought by people who were bankrupt already or did not have money and were borrowing money from people, not knowing that the stock market was crashing. In 1939, it was the lowest point of the economic depression. 15 million Americans were unemployed. The unemployment forced Americans into debt due to layoffs, and they were unable to pay these debts back. So there was a lot of bankruptcies, foreclosures during this time, which led to half of the country's banks failing. Agriculture affected. Prior to the acknowledgement of the economic depression, African Americans felt the first wave of the Great Depression. In 1920s, 1 million African Americans migrated to the north from the south. The reason for this was the overproduction of cotton combined with the falling prices due to the overproduction of cotton led African Americans into poverty. The Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933, underneath President Roosevelt, stated that he wanted to plant fewer acres and reduce farm production, and he unwillingly gave impetus to the eviction of tenants from the land, according to Franklin. This meant that landowners would kick African Americans off their property due to inability to pay rent or the fact that they did not need them as workers anymore due to the reduction of crop sizes. The abuse from the landowners did not stop there. They were eventually not distributing African Americans their fair share of the profits, which led to more starvation and more migration up north. African Americans were hit first with the early onset economic depression. In the mid-1920s, thousands of African American urban dwellers lost their jobs. Urban dwellers were people who moved into the city for greater opportunities. However, during this time, that ended up being false. Job loss claimed as casualties of a technological age in which several million people inevitably became unemployed due to their low skills. In cities, African Americans lost their jobs completely. In rural areas, their wage plummeted below starvation wages. The search for opportunities. Southern Black professionals unified with whites to try and stop migration out of the region. The middle-class Southern African Americans were divided. Some wanted to stay in the area, some wanted to go and try and feed their families by following their clientele. However, all income primarily depended on African American consumerism within themselves. African American barbers were cutting African American hair. African American lawyers were representing African American clientele due to racism during this time. It was a really hard time for them. African American women. African American women felt a loss of household jobs and personal service occupations. The little help that they had for their families was now gone. Fannie Peck, a wonderful woman, in 1930 formed the Housewives League of Detroit, which they would band together to clothe, feed, and house families. Although this is not the complete list of all the things the women did, in the following slide, we will indulge a little more. Boycotts. Boycotts and protests during the Great Depression. The first boycott was Jobs for Negroes. This was created in the 1930s and it began in St. Louis. It was originally created by the Urban League, and it was a stance against white-owned chain store whose trade was almost exclusively Black, but carried no Black employees on its payroll. This trend followed through Pittsburgh, Chicago, Cleveland, and other Midwestern cities, where they'd pick it outside of there until they were either hiring a African-American or would make some type of change. In the end, they did create a lot of change in hiring. 15 African-American women were hired as sales clerks in an all-white department store. And a lot of African-American males were hired in other stores, grocery stores and such. Now, the following 3 boycotts, the meat boycott, the rent eviction, and the electricity shutoffs, were all started by women. The meat boycotts were in the 1930s, and they were from New York, Detroit, and St. Louis. The rent eviction boycott was in the 1930s, New York, Detroit, and St. Louis. The electricity shutoffs were in the 1930s, however, they remained in Cleveland. Now, the meat boycotts and the rent evictions and electricity shutoffs were them not wanting to be evicted out of their home, the electricity shutoff, not wanting them to shut off the electricity because everyone was suffering during this time. It just did not seem fair to have everyone suffer. Relief efforts. African Americans wanted to help each other during a hard time. So the National Negro Business League created Colored Merchants Association in New York in 1929, kind of a shop local stance. They created stores in New York, which would buy items when needed, but also provide jobs for African Americans. So the ideal was for African Americans to shop and work where their money was cared for and no discrimination was found. Each store approximately had a 2-year run before closing during the severity of the Great Depression, which is a great amount of time during that time. Riots. Tensions rose in the households and financially and racially. In 1935, African-American youth caught stealing a penknife from the counter of a store escaped, but rumors had flew that he had passed away. On March 19th, the night of March 19th, 200 windows were smashed and $2 million worth of damage was found. On top of that, 3 African-Americans were killed due to a rumor. He had escaped. Everyone had thought he didn't. It's very sad. This led to Mayor LaGuardia in New York starting an interracial committee on conditions in Harlem. This came with a staff of investigators. One investigator was E. Franklin Frazier, a sociologist. His conclusion in this riot was that resentments against racial discrimination and poverty in the midst of plenty was what had caused it. In other words, white people were getting more help than African Americans were. And white people didn't want to help African Americans, but African Americans were willing to help everyone. And it racially tensions grew because everyone just wanted equality. One of my favorites slides are the effects on the artwork. During this time, a lot of African Americans were actually in vogue. They were indulging in luxurious parties with famous, artistes and literature and things of that sort. But James Van Der Zee, a Harlem photographer, lost his business due to clientele being unable to pay for their services. There's a picture on the left-hand side showing him. Now, W.E. Du Bois had a quote right before the economic depression hit, and I would love to share with you guys. We Black folk have within us as a race new stirrings of the beginning of a new appreciation of joy, of a new desire to create, of a new will to be, as though in this morning of group life we had awakened from some sleep that at once dimly mourns the past and dreams a splendid future. Conclusion. African Americans suffered the Great Depression prior to the rest of the world. The combination of overproduction of cotton, along with the Agricultural Adjustment Act left the African Americans with nothing. This forced African Americans to survive on their own while still trying to create a better outcome. African Americans left their impact on jobs and the rest of the world with their determination to remain in the workforce and in their homes, such as creating an environment for African American women to be hired at white department stores, along with African American men being hired at any jobs that they would take their money. People would take their money, but they wouldn't hire them. It's just sad. They also created a bond with trying to create their own businesses in New York as they were forced to leave the South in search of more opportunities that the landowners were denying them. And that is my conclusion. I hope you guys enjoyed.